Hello and welcome to another video. Today I'm bringing you a pretty messed up marketing story. Now, we know Nestle as the manufacturer of some of our favourite products, but what you might not know is that they were responsible for the death of thousands of young babies living in developing countries. Nestle became one of the leading companies when it came to baby formula powders, but they were always very adamant that breast is best. But as this story starts to unfold, you will see that they massively contradicted themselves with that thinking. So baby formula powder started to be widely distributed to wealthier, more Western countries when it was first invented in the late 1800s. Now, baby formula was a very expensive product, and in fact it was more marketed towards wealthier individuals. This meant that not everyone had access to it. By the 1950s, baby formula powder was pretty much almost replaced by liquid formula. This was because women loved how easy it was compared to powder. In the 1960s, however, sales in baby formula powder and liquid started to decrease dramatically. Now, this, in my personal opinion, is due to the fact there was a lot of pressure from society for women to breastfeed. And researchers then believed that it would create a better bond between a mother and their child. It was more nutritionally valuable for a child to be breastfed, and there was just a lot of emphasis on breastfeeding. So with these sales slowly dwindling, companies such as Nestle started to move to other areas around the world to boost their sales. And they moved to developing countries in Asia, Africa, and South America. So let's skip to the 1970s. This was a decade full of social change. So women started to get more rights, and the second wave of feminism was created. Britain had their first female prime minister, and the sexual revolution began.
So as I edit this, I realise I said the sexual revolution starts in the 1970s. It actually began in the 60s, but it was a really pivotal movement throughout the 70s.
With this social change came more involved social rights groups, and they began to see right through Nestle's horrific and exploitive tactics. Nestle went to many different developing countries and tried to get babies hooked on formula. They gave them free samples. They even tried to bribe doctors into promoting how good formula was compared to breastfeeding. They would send sale representatives out in nurse uniforms to maternity wards, and they would try to convince women to start formula feeding. It was like an old-fashioned MLM scheme. In the Philippines, nurses would go to dwellings where quite often poor people would be living, and if they saw a nappy, or a diaper as you may call it, hanging on a clothesline, they knew that that meant a newborn baby had just arrived. So that would be their new specific target when they were trying to sell more formula. Some countries, such as Singapore, actually started to cotton on to the fact that Nestle was sending in their nurses, and they banned them from coming into maternity units altogether. So these nurses would teach mothers how to correctly use the formula so that when they left, they knew that the mothers were comfortable in feeding their child. Nestle basically created a need for a product that never even existed in the first place. They also convinced these mothers that formula was absolutely necessary. And this is the problem that social activist groups had with the formula scandal. It was the fact that they went into developing countries with the same marketing strategy that they had used in wealthier countries. They fully believed that a campaign they used for more economically rich countries would work in less affluent areas. They didn't even bother to change the prices of their products so that it would align with their living wages or their living expenses. It wasn't just developing countries that were struggling with baby formula though. I read a report, which I will put in the description, about how other countries that were particularly more wealthy had the same issue. So apparently in Britain, because there was not enough education surrounding formula and how to use it properly, children were also dying of malnutrition. And they found that babies were still suffering from diseases that were passed down through bottle feeding. At this point, I know it might sound like a massive ploy against bottle feeding, but that is not the case at all. The report and what I'm trying to get across in this video is that it's not formula feeding that is the problem at all. Fed is best, in my opinion. What the problem is the fact that there was no education surrounding formula at all. The report also states that children born in Chile that were formula fed had a higher mortality rate than their siblings who were exclusively breastfed. The misuse of baby formula led to malnutrition, and malnutrition meant that a baby was more susceptible to infectious diseases, and then of course death would be inevitable. A doctor explained in the same report that this is something they refer to as marasmus. Now, I'm not a doctor or a scientist. In fact, I did BTEC science, so I don't know many medical or scientific terms, but I will try to explain to you as best as I can. So what would happen is a child would stop gaining weight, then all of their weight would fall off of them, and they would start to look like an old, shriveled up man. This is a quote directly from the report, by the way. They became far more susceptible to infection, and usually these infections would directly affect the gut and intestines. Their body basically learns to not accept food. This eventually leads to a very drawn out, painful death. Another problem with this scandal was the fact that women couldn't afford the formula. As I mentioned, they never bothered to alter the prices. So this would lead to women not being able to buy more for their child. When these representatives eventually left and went back, they only had samples left. Now, you may or may not know this, but when a woman stops breastfeeding, her milk supply eventually dries up. This may take like 7 to 10 days, or it might take longer. And Nestle knew that this would happen, but what they anticipated was that as soon as the mother's breast milk would dry up and they ran out of formula, they would just go back to the shop and buy more. Like I said though, they didn't alter the price, so women literally couldn't afford to buy formula and feed their child. So what mothers would quite often do is obviously buy a new bit of formula, but they would try and drag it out for as long as possible. So they would dilute what they were giving their child. They wouldn't put in as much powder as they should. And of course, this is what led to malnutrition, as I've just talked about. It was claimed that in fact, only 1 out of every 4 women were using the correct amount of formula with the right amount of water. And malnutrition in babies causes short-term effects, but it also causes long-term damage as well. In this report as well, another doctor talks about a really interesting study where he tried to link malnutrition in babies to the size of their brain. I'm not going to try and explain it on this because, quite frankly, as I said, I'm awful with medical and science things, but if you want to read the report, I would strongly advise you to, because it is so interesting. Another problem with the formula was the fact that many of the women were getting unclean water for their baby's formula. Why is it windy? Many of the mothers went to rivers to get water for their child's formula, but as you probably know, dirty water is a breeding ground for infectious diseases such as cholera. And in most countries, they were not able to sterilise their baby's bottles before feeding and after feeding. So basically, the dirty water contaminated the bottle, and it was just an ongoing pattern. These poor mothers were fighting so many battles. I won't say that Nestle were the only culprits in this story. The only reason why I focus on them so much is because there is a lot of research and a lot of evidence to suggest that Nestle were a big culprit in this whole baby formula scandal. But other companies did use horrific marketing strategies as well. They also used psychological tactics because they knew that if a woman felt enough fear and anxiety, they would eventually stop lactating, which meant they had no choice but to buy formula. So they would put fear into the mothers' minds and tell them that breastfeeding was going to fail, that it could cause your breasts to sag, or that only peasants do it. And this really made women think, wow, maybe I shouldn't be breastfeeding. Maybe it isn't the right choice for me. So I'm gonna read you an actual jingle that was on the radio to try and sell baby formula. The child is going to die because the mother's breast has given out. Mama, oh mama, the child cries. If you want your child to get well, give it KLIM milk. Or Clim milk, I'm not really sure how that's pronounced. But imagine that, if you're a mother and you're sat there and you're breastfeeding your child and you hear that on the radio, that is going to have a severe impact on you and how you view breastfeeding. As you can see, there was a lot of differing information and propaganda floating about for mothers. Nestle and other companies were abusing their power by not helping mothers make informed decisions on their own body and their child's well-being. And that is the infant formula scandal. One thing I will say before I end this video is that I actually did quite a lot of reading and research on this. I couldn't find an awful lot because I feel like it's buried in the depths of history. But I did read something that Nestle wrote themselves, and it goes into the history of baby formula and the history of Nestle themselves, and they do own up to the fact that they did not use the right tactics. Obviously this is inexcusable and no mother should have to be treated like that. They weren't treated with dignity or respect. But at least Nestle has owned up to the fact that this happened and they have not tried to hide it. So that concludes this video and I hope you enjoy it. Don't forget to subscribe, follow me on Instagram and TikTok if you're not from TikTok. And if you want me to create a video on any topic of your choice, then just send me a message on any of my platforms or comment below. And I will see you on the next video.